thanks for the opportunity for coming along and speaking tonight. This is the first outing for this talk beyond the Imperial War Museum. I was asked to put this together for work. We're looking at Duxford to produce a First World War narrative for part of the Duxford site, and we're looking at doing it in the sort of 1918 period of like when the RAF were involved in the all-arms battle to sort of win the war. So this talk comes out of that. That's why you find me over the Western Front rather than over Salonika or Mesopotamia or somewhere like that, which is my usual stomping ground. Anyway, 1918, of course, Britain establishes the world's first independent military air service, the Royal Air Force. And at the armistice, it totaled frontline strength of 3,300 aircraft in around 188 squadrons. There were 30,000 officers and 260,400 other ranks. Now, this is a far cry from the RFC that went overseas in August 1914, which totaled 63 aircraft in 4 squadrons and 105 officers. I don't have a number for the other ranks, but obviously it was correspondingly small. But by the armistice in November 1918, the RAF had established a well-defined set of operational roles and had become a key component in the Allied victory over Germany. Now, this talk is looking to tell the story of how the RAF achieved that, and I'm going to do it through looking at 10 aircraft. There will be other aircraft mentioned, not just these 10. And these 10 aircraft, I believe, help define what the RFC-RAF air war over the Western Front was, how it evolved, and also the future role of the RAF, the development of that as an independent military force after 1918. So you may not agree with the 10 aircraft I've picked, but you know, we've all got favourites and we've all got ones that we think are important. But these are my 10, so feel free to argue the toss with me afterwards. Air power obviously was increasingly important during the First World War, and the critical role for the RFC and later RAF was direct support for the army. This would be photo reconnaissance flights, artillery spotting, flying contact patrols, and increasingly as the war went on, getting involved in ground attack operations. As well as being an integral part of victory on land in 1918, the RAF was also developing independent roles. These were strategic bombing and fighter defence of the UK as a part of the integrated home defence network. And the evolution of the RAF and its rapid expansion towards the end of the First World War can be seen in Duxford. Duxford exists because it was one of the new training bases for aircrew who were going to crew the 2-seater squadrons that were involved in many of the army support roles, but also independent operations such as strategic bombing. And the surviving hangars, training and technical buildings on the site that are still there today are a witness to these early days of the Royal Air Force. Obviously, Dux is more famous as being part of Battle of Britain with Barda and the big wing flying from there, but its roots are back in the end of the First World War. So let's look at the first of the aircraft that helped shape the air war for the British over the Western Front. And it is, of course, the good old BE-2 series of aircraft, in particularly the BE-2C and then later the BE-2E. This was really the workhorse of the RFC between 1914 and 1917. And we've got to remember that the RFC was established in April 1912 with an army and a naval wing, but the Royal Navy wanted full control over its flying service and unilaterally established an autonomous existence for its naval wing as the Royal Naval Air Service, and that was formally recognised in July 1914. And this led to a divergence between the two flying services and led to some competition over resources in terms of aircraft and aero engines. And there was always be a problem with aero engines, especially for the RFC during the war. Now, the RFC that went to France in August 1914 was made up of numerous types of aircraft. Just about anything that could fly across the channel was basically sent. The problem with that is it wasn't particularly good in terms of, it wasn't efficient because you've got lots of different types of aircraft there. So serviceability, spare parts, pilot knowledge of aircraft that could be flown, mechanics knowledge of how to repair them, and also just generally manufacturing stuff to keep these aircraft in the air or replace them. So the idea was to get a standardized single general purpose machine as far as possible. And for reasons of economy, the RFC was reliant quite heavily on the Royal Aircraft Factory. And the main requirement in 1914 was for a two-seater reconnaissance aircraft. And the B-2C fitted the bill pretty well. It was a very stable aircraft. Some people said it almost sort of flew itself. The pilot, however, sat in the rear cockpit with the observer in the front. So not great observation for the observer. As ideas of aerial fighting moved away from people taking up rifles, shotguns, or trying to throw hand grenades at each other, the B2 proved not to be a great fighting platform because it is a very, very stable aircraft. That's what it was designed to do, for reconnaissance, not throw itself around in the sky. But it could mount a Lewis gun, firing forward, but at an angle to miss the propeller. Okay, so you had to be flying, you had to learn not to point your aircraft directly at what you were trying to shoot down, but to sort of get off at an angle to it to actually open fire. Now, despite these drawbacks, the B2C and E were the machines on which the RFC learnt and expanded its core trade of cooperation with ground forces. And one of the main roles that it had was aerial photography. Aerial photography reinvented how the battlefield was viewed. Trench deadlock on the Western Front at the end of 1914 meant that you couldn't get behind enemy lines by traditional means, so cavalry patrols, etc., to see what the enemy was up to. But the aeroplane gave you an elevated observation platform, mobile observation platform as well. And it's an example of war driving technology forward. And the RFC quickly moved from using handheld Pan-Ross press cameras to using and designing and using specialist aerial cameras from 1915 onwards. Commanders on the ground were, early on, some of them were quite skeptical about the usefulness of aerial photography, but they were quickly overcome by results. And the first major use of aerial photography by the British in military planning was at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915. Charles Darley of 3 Squadron was constantly up over the front photographing the German lines. And his photographs showed that the Germans had constructed new trenches, and that knowledge led to a modification of the attack plans for Neuve-Chapelle. Darley also pioneered the fusing together of photographic prints to form mosaics, which later became standard practice in the RFC and later the RAF. These photographs, of course, weren't just used for planning, they were also used to help the Royal Engineers produce detailed trench maps. And those trench maps produced by the Royal Engineer Field Survey Companies were put together by a combination of ground level plane table surveying by the engineers and the use of aerial photographs. Haig was quickly won over by aerial photography, and he was a major advocate for its use and dissemination across command structure of the BEF. And from 1916, aerial photography was a standard part of the BEF's intelligence gathering network. Also pioneered using B2Cs, B2Es was artillery spotting. In 1914, most artillery fire was direct fire, as in firing at targets the gunners could see. But of course, trench warfare and the longer, increasingly long range of guns meant that indirect fire, i.e. on targets you can't see, had to come into play. But the problem was, how do you locate a target that you can't see? Well, again, the aeroplane is the tool to use. The aeroplane can spot these and send messages back, or it can photograph the positions and that information is then plotted and used by the artillery. The aeroplane will also spot for the fall of shells and range the guns in on those targets. Initially, air-to-ground signals were coloured flares, so the coloured flares would be dropped by the aircraft to tell the artillery how close they were to the target. But obviously, that's only good if the visibility is good. 1915, they developed a wireless, the £20 sterling wireless, so it could be carried in a B-2C without unduly affecting its performance, which was good because, let's face it, the B-2C's performance wasn't that great anyway. So luckily, this wireless could be carried and the aircraft was still performing its function. This came in at the same time as the clock code, which was developed by Lieutenants Donald Lewis and Baron James. Here, a celluloid disc would be placed on the map with the target at the centre, 12 lines radiated out from the centre as per the hours on a clock, and then there were 8 concentric rings set at distances from the target. Y and Z were in the middle target circle, Y being 10 yards from the target, Z being 25. The other concentric rings are 50 yards away, so A is 50, B 100, C 150, etc. After making initial wireless contact by Morse with the artillery battery, now you've got to remember that this communication is only one way. The aeroplane communicates with the ground. The artillery at this time cannot communicate with the aircraft. That comes in much later in the war with two-way radio transmitter and receiver that could be carried by the aircraft. So once that initial Morse call comes out, the answer by the battery was then putting out some ground markers to say, yes, we've heard you, we can get the communications going. The aircraft then flies onto the target and starts to range the initial shots. So say the first shot came down and would be signaled back as A9, that would mean the shot had fallen 50 yards west of the target. And then you would keep correcting that until you were on the target. And when you were on the target, the aircraft would signal OK. It would then signal go on firing or gunfire, and then general corrections on the fall of shot would be given if needed. Once the target appeared destroyed, the aircraft would signal end to stop firing, and the end of the shoot would be marked by the aeroplane signaling CI, which means coming in, which would mean the aircraft will be returning to its base. Now, to improve signals communication between the aircraft and the battery, RFC wireless operators were placed in artillery batteries to take those messages. The clock code remained in place throughout the war, and battery officers and squadron officers would visit each other's units for greater familiarisation and to build a very close working relationship, and that worked very well. Now, all this was going on, these B-2Cs were flying around, not threatened particularly much, and then the second of the aircraft we're going to talk about came into operation, and this is a German aircraft. This is the Fokker E1, or the Fokker Eindecker. And it was really the world's first true fighter aircraft. Now, the increasing amount of recce work, artillery spotting, etc., that was being done by both sides couldn't go unanswered. And in the early days, individual pilots armed their aircraft, as I've said before, rifles, etc., and in a pretty ad hoc fashion, mounting those Lewis guns on sideward firing mounts, etc. But it was generally unsuccessful. What they really needed to do to solve the problem was to fire a machine gun directly forward through the propeller. But obviously that's pretty dangerous because you don't want to shoot your propeller blades off, because if you do that, you're not going to be in the air for very long. Lieutenant Roland Garros, if you know tennis, the Roland Garros, their version of Wimbledon is named after this chap. He was a French fighter ace, and what he did was he fitted metal deflector plates on his propeller blades because he worked out that only a few bullets from the machine gun would actually strike the prop blades, and these could be deflected by these metal plates. And on the 1st of April 1915, he successfully shot down a German reconnaissance aircraft. The French then fitted numerous of their scout aircraft with deflector plates. Unfortunately for Roland Garros, on the 18th of April 15, he was forced to land behind German lines due to engine failure. His aircraft was captured and passed to Anthony Fokker to copy the deflector plates. But Fokker went one better, and he went back to pre-war experiments with interrupter gears. And the idea with an interrupter gear was that this would coordinate the rate of fire of the machine gun with the revolutions of the propeller blade, so that when the propeller blade was in line with the fire of the machine gun, the mechanism would prevent the machine gun from firing. He harnessed the interrupter gear to the Fokker Eindecker, and that gave the German Air Force a massive advantage over the Western Front in 1915. The Fokker E1 was deployed in the autumn of that year, and led by Oswald Bolker and Max Immelmann, the Eindecker pilots quickly took a toll of the slow, stable B-2s. In fact, the first confirmed E1 victory was scored by Immelmann on the 1st of August 1915. Now, the Eindecker had a strong tubular steel frame, which gave it excellent diving characteristics. And the tactics used would be to fly high and then dive into the attack from behind, where the B-2 and many other aircraft were actually not defended from the rear. Now, if the target was not shot down in the first pass, the Eindecker would climb again and repeat the attack. This would be part of the Immelmann turn, and it enabled a second attack or evasion from being attacked or escape from combat altogether. What would happen is that either from the dive or from being pursued, the pilot would execute the first part of a loop. At the apex of the loop, the pilot would roll out his plane onto the level, as you can see here at the top of the diagram. This would mean he was then facing and flying 180 degrees from his former direction. This meant that he could either turn and dive for a renewed attack or quickly head off away from the enemy and away from the fight. The dominance of the Fokker E1s, E2s and E3s became known as a Fokker scourge, and over 100 Allied aircraft fell to the Eindeckers. It was a great actual and physiological, psychological impact the Eindeckers had, even though there were not more than 50 of them serviceable at any one time, and only 300 of these aircraft were ever produced. So it had a rate of moral and actual effect greater out of proportion to its numbers, just showing how important this aircraft was. There was obviously high loss in aircrew here, and this was particularly the problem about amongst replacement aircrew. And this was generally down to their lack of training. Many of the new RFC pilots coming to France had only 20 hours solo and very little in the way of combat training. Most of that was learned on the job. So it's a case of staying alive. The longer you stayed alive, the better pilot you were going to be, and the more chance you had of actually learning your actual trade. They were also obviously flying much poorer aircraft, such as the B-2. And the Eindeckers were also operating in groups of 3 or 4 aircraft, really outmatching whatever the RFC had to offer. And on the 16th of January 1916, Hugh Trenchard, the head of the RFC in France, was forced to issue an order that stated that any British reconnaissance machine going over the front had to be escorted by 3 fighting machines in close formation. And if any of these escorts were detached, the recce flight had to be abandoned. So this just showed the effect. We're sending up 4 aircraft here to just take one set of photographs or spot for the artillery. This resulted in a huge drop-off in the amount of work the RFC could do, and such things as bombing and long-range reconnaissance basically stopped. This was totally against Trenchard's strategy for the RFC, which was always to fight the war over the German side of the lines. The RFC was subordinate to the needs of the army, so reconnaissance, artillery spotting and bombing had to be done to support the army on the ground. They also had to prevent the Germans from undertaking similar operations over the British lines, and ultimately what they were trying to do was to secure air superiority. So they had to find a way to overcome the Eindecker. And because they didn't have interrupter gears, what the British ingeniously did was to develop the pusher. And the pusher was an aircraft with the engine behind the pilot. So you could fire a machine gun directly ahead because there was no propeller in front of you. So a good way forward. The concept was developed initially with the Vickers gun bus in 1915. And the FE2B and DH2, which were developments, began arriving in early 1916. The FE2B was a two-seater armed with 2 to 3 Lewis guns. It wasn't a great single combat aircraft, especially against the Eindecker, but they developed a tactic of flying in formation, and when attacked, they would circle round and use their Lewis guns for sort of mutual defence. By contrast, the DH2 was a nimble single-seat fighter. It overcame its initial poor reputation, nicknamed the spinning incinerator to start off with, so perhaps not the sort of plane that many new pilots would want to get into. But thanks to the RAF's first ace, Lanoy Hawker, he overcame the prejudice against this machine. And it actually equipped the first true RFC fighter squadron, number 24, which Hawker was commanding, and they went to France in February 1916. The RFC were also given a number of the highly manoeuvrable and fast Newport 11s, which the British called the Newport Scout, and this had proved its worth against the Eindeckers over Verdun. Didn't have a synchronized machine gun firing through the propeller, but it did have a Lewis gun mounted on the top wing, which could fire forward, which was a great improvement. And it was in this type of aircraft that Albert Ball scored his first victories. And together, the DH2 and the Newport 11 really ended the Fokker scourge. And the end of that dominant period for the Germans was marked by the death of Max Immelmann on the 18th of June 1916, when he fell in combat with a number of FE2Bs. The end of the Fokker scourge came just in time because the British were gearing up for the Battle of the Somme, and Haig was calling for greater operations to support the Battle of the Somme as it was going on. So we'll move on to our next aircraft now. And this aeroplane is being included for other reasons than it was a game changer in itself. This aircraft is the Sopwith 1.5 Strutter. This was the first RFC machine to be fitted as standard with an interrupter gear, allowing the mounting of a forward-firing Vickers machine gun, which was much more effective than a Lewis, just having a Lewis gun firing over the top wing. It began arriving with the RFC in service in France in May 1916. It was a multi-role aircraft already in service with the RNAS in 1- and 2-seat versions. A 1-seater version was normally a fighter version, 2-seater bomber reconnaissance type aircraft. The British adoption of the interrupter gear put the RFC up to speed in terms of aircraft armament, but their problem now was to produce enough modern aircraft to wrest control and air superiority from the Germans. And by taking on the Strutter, this sort of begins the RFC's relationship with the Sopwith Company. Now, the Sopwith Company were already producing aircraft for the RNAS, and now the RFC comes across. So there was some clash over the numbers of machines that could be ordered, but a lot of these machines were actually being built under license by other companies. And this started a real fruitful relationship for the RFC and later the RAF with the Sopwith Company, which would see them using the Sopwith Pup, the Camel, the Dolphin, and later the Snipe, amongst others. The 1.5 Strutter was a good rather than a great aeroplane. It had a long range and was well armed in relation to a B-2C. And it was a great shame, really, that this aircraft wasn't available in greater numbers earlier for the core squadrons to replace the B-2C much earlier. It did have a problem that the distance between the pilot and the observer made communications in the air quite difficult. And when it was outclassed in early 1917, it still had a role as a long-distance reconnaissance aircraft, as long as it was escorted by fighters. And it was finally replaced in RFC service in October 1917. And with the RNAS service, the Strutter was mainly used as a bomber, and it equipped number 3 wing. Number 3 wing was the first air formation charged with true strategic bombing, which it began in July 1916. The last thing to say on the Strutter is it also was used by the French, the Belgians, and the Americans, and some were even built under license in Russia. So it really got around the Sopwith 1.5 Strutter. Now the next aircraft is another 2-seater. The RE8, or Harry Tate as it was nicknamed. And this was the long-awaited replacement for the BE2 C&E. But with too few Strutters available, it was down to the Royal Aircraft Factory to replace its original workhorse, and this is the aircraft it came up with. It did have an armament of a synchronized Vickers gun and also a rear-mounted Lewis gun to protect the tail of the aircraft. It had a more powerful engine than the BE2, designed to give more speed, a better rate of climb, and a better carrying capacity. But it was still found to be something underpowered, and this was a problem never resolved due to the shortage of aero engines. It entered service in November 1916 with 52 Squadron, but gained a bad reputation for spinning amongst inexperienced pilots. The modifications to the tail fin increased its stability, but at the expense of making it an easier target because it became a more stable plane. So again, they're having a trade-off here because a lot of these pilots are quite inexperienced in flying. Despite these drawbacks and the lack of a suitable replacement later in the war, the RE8 remains in service right until the end of the First World War, with over 4,000 of them were manufactured. And it's in the RE8 that most aircrew of the core squadrons continued their photo recce, artillery spotting, and tactical bombing duties. Now, interestingly, the RE8 saw the refinement of the contact patrol, which had begun in 1915. Now, this was an attempt to direct, basically to identify the positions of advancing infantry during attacks. The idea was that this would provide commanders on the ground with almost up-to-the-minute information of the progress of a battle. And this in an era where, as we know, battlefield communications are very, very poor. They almost flatline during the war, whereas weapons technology goes up like this, communications technology stooges around until right at the end of the war. So anything that you can do to get information to commanders quickly about where their men are on the battlefield is vital. So a contact patrol, what would you do? Well, a designated aeroplane would fly over a sector of battlefield and make a call to ground forces, usually by sounding a klaxon horn. At that point, the infantry would respond by lighting ground flares, putting out cloth panels, or flashing tin discs into the sun in the aircraft. The observer in the aeroplane would then mark the locations on a map. The aircraft would fly to a pre-designated headquarters and drop the information in a message container. So it's a pretty quick way of getting information back. The big problem was that many of these infantry units didn't really want to show their position, because obviously if you start flashing tin discs in the sun or lighting ground flares, it's not only the aeroplane that's going to see you, it's the enemy as well, and you're potentially going to draw fire. And this led to aeroplanes having to fly really low on the battlefield so they could basically identify the colours of the uniforms of the blokes in the trenches. Obviously, this made them a bigger target to ground fire. So it was a very, very dangerous occupation, flying a contact patrol. The other interesting thing about the RE8 is that in the Battle of Hamel on the 4th of July 1918, RE8s of 9 Squadron made the first parachute airdrop of ammunition, so an ammo resupply from the air, to advanced Australian forces. So another bit of ingenuity there to keep the battle rolling forward in 1918. Despite this sterling work, the RE8 was removed from RAF service immediately after the armistice, as it was well known to be obsolete by this time. Numerous aircraft were sent to the White Russians forces under General Denikin in South Russia, but the newly trained Russian pilots also believed the type to be dangerous, and there was an uphill struggle by RAF instructors to change the Russian pilots' minds. Now, unfortunately for the RE8, reasonable aircraft though it had the misfortune to come into service at exactly the same time as the next aircraft we're going to look at, which is the Albatros DIII. This was a development of the already excellent Albatros D1 and D2. It was a fast, robust fighter with a good rate of climb, considered pleasant and easy to fly. The only real flaw it had was the weakness of its lower wings, and pilots were advised not to perform steep or prolonged dives. It was built in large numbers by the Austro-Hungarians and used by them as well in Italy and on the Eastern Front, and a total of 1,866 were completed, and the aircraft was still in service well into 1918, despite the introduction of the upgraded Albatros D5. This aircraft and the earlier D2 re-established German air superiority over the Western Front early in 1917. And this culminated in the period known as Bloody April, as the RFC suffered huge losses. They lost during that month 151 aircraft and 316 aircrew. Life expectancy at the time for a new RFC pilot was 17 days, and it's the worst point of the war for the RFC. The D3, along with smaller numbers of D1s and D2 Albatros, were the mainstay of the German Jasters, the specialist fighter units established in August 1916. Most famous was Jaster II, formerly under the command of Oswald Bolker, then after his death in a mid-air collision in October 1916, commanded by Manfred von Richthofen. In April 17, there were 4 of these Jasters at Douai near Arras, and they were combined into the famous Flying Circus. They would fly standing patrols of 6 to 8 fighters, and these were supplemented at morning and evening by large-scale patrols. Their aim was to sweep the RFC two-seaters from the skies around Arras, and the success they had allowed for increased German air activity over British lines. Those horrendous losses suffered by the RFC were basically down to air superiority thanks to the Albatros D3 and Trenchard's insistence that the RFC had to maintain its supporting role for the British Army during the Battle of Arras. They had to keep going forward, flying these reconnaissance, artillery spotting missions, etc. They had to do it. This played into German hands, really, because their tactics were these huge fighter sweeps over the front line, and they always attacked when holding numerical advantage. In the words of Manfred von Richthofen, he didn't go looking for the enemy. He said, let the customer come to the shop. And the RFC really needed to counter the Albatros D3. Unfortunately, it only had 2 squadrons of Sopwith pups. This was really the only machine it had that was capable of holding its own against the D3. The pup had 1 forward-firing Vickers gun. It was slower than the Albatros, but much more manoeuvrable. RNAS lent squadrons of pups and Sopwith triplanes to the RFC to help battle the Albatros fear. And they flew escorts to reconnaissance machines. So we're back to that thing about you have to send your recce plane out with some escorts. So it's really a case of deja vu for any of those RFC pilots who would come through the Fokker scourge of 1915. So the British really have to develop something that can counter and can wrest air superiority back from the Germans. And they managed this in 1917 by introducing our next aircraft. Actually, I'm going to cheat here. It's 2 because I can't really choose between them. It's sort of like choosing between the Spitfire and Hurricane in the Battle of Britain. So I'm going to say it's the SE5 and Sopwith Camel combination, really. The SE5A was the best aircraft designed by the Royal Aircraft Factory, one of the fastest aircraft of the First World War. It was a fantastically stable gun platform, but also a highly maneuverable machine. It had excellent performance at altitude. This ensured it was a match for even the Fokker D7 when it was introduced in 1918. And that meant that the D7 never really overly challenged this air superiority that the British established. It had one forward-firing synchronized Vickers machine gun and a Lewis gun on the top wing, and it was able to carry 4 25-pound bombs. It was flown by leading aces such as Albert Ball, James McCudden, and Mick Mannock. It had a rather inauspicious start to its career. The initial design, the SE-5, was found to be underpowered, and when it went into service with 56 Squadron in April 1917, pilots found many teething problems with it, especially the engine, and Albert Ball and others suggested improvements. These were adopted, and the SE-5A, the improved variant, was born. And Ball went on to score 11 of his 44 victories flying an SE-5A. Now, there was some delay in getting the SE-5A into wide squadron service due to a shortage of engines, yet again. And the first entered service in June 1917 with 56 Squadron. But by the end of the war, there were 21 RAF squadrons and 2 US squadrons equipped with SE-5As. Moving on to the Camel, if the SE-5A was the perfect gun platform, the Sopwith Camel was an excellent dogfighting machine. With 2 synchronized Vickers machine guns mounted in a metal fairing to protect the gun breeches from freezing at high altitudes, this created a hump at the front of the aircraft, gave it its name, the Camel. This was a highly maneuverable aircraft in the hands of skilled pilots, but it could be potentially lethal to a novice. 90% of the weight of this aircraft, that is the engine, the pilot, the guns, and the fuel tank, are packed into the first 7 foot of the airframe. That and the fact that the rotary engine produced a huge right-hand torque when it spun meant that it could turn very quickly, but you could easily get into a spin and get out of control if the pilot was too heavy-handed and didn't know how to fly the machine properly. And there was an RFC joke that the Camel offered you a choice, either a wooden cross, a red cross, or the Victoria Cross. And to assist new pilots in coming to terms with this aircraft, some 2-seater training versions were actually developed. The Camel first came into service with the RNAS in June 1917 and soon after with the RFC. And it was widely used by the RFC as a fighter, including as a home defence night fighter. And the RFC used it as a carrier-borne aircraft. Over 5,000 were produced, and it's credited with shooting down 1,294 enemy aircraft. That is more than any other type of British aircraft in the First World War. Oh, excuse me. So, in a way, the Camel and the SE-5A complemented each other in combat. And along with the excellent French SPAD 13, they won air superiority back for the Allies in the second half of 1917. And this position was never lost, despite the Germans introducing the Albatros DIII and, of course, the famous Fokker D7. Now, in the final years of the war, these 2 fighters were thrown into ground attack roles. Since the start of the war, attempts had been made to bomb ground targets, mostly targets of opportunity. This especially really came into play from the Battle of the Somme onwards. But in the German spring offensive, everybody was thrown in ad hoc into this ground attack mix. Every available aircraft was risked to stem the tide of the German advance. And these low-level strafing attacks on troop concentrations and transport led to casualty rates of up to 30% of the aircraft sent out in each operation. From the Battle of Amiens in August 1918 onwards, ground attack became an integral part of British tactical planning for that 100 days offensive. And air power was integrated into the all-arms battle. Some squadrons developed specialist roles. Number 8 Squadron, for instance, under Trafford Lee-Mallory, famous in the Battle of Britain later on, of course, were assigned to support the tank corps, and they became expert at spotting and destroying German anti-tank guns. So that's what's happening on the battlefield. Now, the next aircraft is going to take us away from that core army cooperation role into the strategic field of bombing. And that aircraft is another German aeroplane, and it's the Gotha G4 bomber. Now, strategic bombing of the UK had started in 1915 with airships, but airships were pretty much a problematic weapon. They were very much at the mercy of the weather and atmospheric conditions. Flying at night, they had very poor navigational aids and quite often missed their target. In fact, many of the missions flown against London even missed the city of London. So it just shows you how difficult it was in one of these airships to actually reach your target. The other problem, of course, is it's filled with hydrogen, and once explosive bullets were introduced, the days of the airships were basically numbered. They had a major morale impact on the civilian population, but caused really not that much damage. Now, the introduction of bomber aircraft was really a game changer. They were less at the mercy of the weather. They were able to fly in mutually defensive formations in daylight, so it was easier to navigate around and find their targets. And a formation of bomber aircraft could carry a greater bomb load than a single airship. And because the British Home Defence Network was basically geared up to fight Zeppelins, when the bombers came along, it threw the whole network off balance, and they had to come up and deal with a totally new problem. By 1918, they had established the London Air Defence Area. This was to deal with the bombers coming over at night by this time. And what they had was London was ringed by anti-aircraft gun areas, in between which were night fighter patrol zones. The Observer Corps and light ships out in the North Sea would report sightings and soundings of approaching aircraft. And just east of London, there was a barrage balloon apron. Apart from radar, this is pretty similar to the defensive system around London in 1914 in the Battle of Britain. And once the RFC RAF had good aircraft, such as Sopwith Camels and Bristol fighters, they had marked success against the German bombers, and 24 of them in total were actually shot down. Now, the British public's reaction to the bombing of London and other towns and cities was, of course, a call for reprisals. And this brought the RFC into strategic bombing, the type of mission pioneered, as I've already said, by the RNAS back in 1916 with its Sopwith 1.5 Strutters. And in October 1917, the RFC formed 41 Wing with 2 RFC and 1 RNAS squadron. They were based at Nancy in France, and they had their target was basically industrial and rail targets in German towns and cities. Their first operational mission was against Saarbrücken, and 11 aircraft went on that bombing raid on the 17th of October 1917. In December 1917, 2 more bomber squadrons were added to the formation, and it was renamed 8th Brigade. And in June 1918, it was renamed the Independent Air Force and placed under the command of Sir Hugh Trenchard. By that time, it numbered 4 day bombing and 5 night bombing squadrons. The first night bomber was the FE-2B. We've already encountered this back in the days of the Fokker Scourge, where it was being used as a fighter. Now it's being used as a night bomber. It was very successful. 860 of these aircraft were used. They could carry 500 pounds of bombs. These aircraft were replaced by the RAF's first heavy bomber, which was the Handley Page 0400, a development of the 0100, which was in service with the RNAS. This machine had a wingspan of 100 feet and a length of 62 feet, so it's almost the same size as a Lancaster. Had a bomb load of 2,000 pounds, a range of 700 miles, and an endurance of 8 hours. And between June and November 1918, Handley Page aircraft made 650 bombing raids against military and industrial targets, dropping high explosive and incendiary bombs. Many of the targets would become famous in the Second World War bomber Harris's bomber offensive. Cities such as Mannheim, Saarbrücken, and Cologne were all hit in 1918. So we're doing it in 1918 and repeating it in the Second World War. In November 1918, the RAF were actually planning to bomb Berlin, staging a Handley Page V-1500 via Prague as Austria-Hungary had broken up and the Czechs had declared independence. But the armistice intervened, so that mission was never flown. However, one V-1500 was flown out to India, and in May 1919, it bombed Kabul and helped bring to end the Third Afghan War. Surplus O-400 bombers helped kickstart the British civil aviation industry in 1915. Sir Frederick Handley Page, with great foresight, established Handley Page Transport, the first airmail and passenger flight services flown between London and Paris, flew from the Handley Page airfield at Cricklewood in northwest London soon after the war. But we're going to look at another bomber aircraft now as our 8th aeroplane, and it is the DH-4. This was Britain's first purpose-built day bomber, probably the best single-seat bomber of the First World War. It was fast and easy to fly, able to take sufficient punishment in combat, and had a ceiling of 20,000 feet and could carry 460 pounds of bombs. Its performance was not affected when carrying a full bomb load. This made it very popular with its crew, as its speed and altitude performance enabled it to avoid interception by all but the best German fighters. The first unit equipped with this aircraft was 55 Squadron in March 1917. The type was also very good on army level cooperation missions. It was flying bombing targets behind German lines to hit railheads, HQs, and supply depots. It was also used for long-distance, high-altitude photo reconnaissance operations. And in fact, Frederick Laws, the father of British aerial photography, felt that the DH-4 was the best aerial reconnaissance platform of the First World War. Now, once strategic bombing began, numbers of DH-4s came into the Independent Air Force, and the squadron started daylight bombing on German targets using its speed and altitude, high altitude flying, and it flew in mutually defended formations, so it didn't need fighter escort. And here are some DH-9As doing the same thing. The only drawback, like with the 1.5 Strutter, the pilot and the observer are a bit too far apart. In the DH-4, they're separated by the fuel tank. So again, communication within the aircraft was quite difficult. To overcome that, they redesigned the aircraft slightly and tried to give it another engine, which is supposedly better. And this was a DH-9, but unfortunately, the engine didn't live up to its high spec. And in fact, the DH-9 was found to have a worse performance than the DH-4. But 9 squadrons were operating DH-9s in mid-1918 and suffering heavy casualties from German fighters. But it would take the re-engineing of this type with the US Liberty V12 engine to produce a true successor to the DH-4, and that would be the DH-9A. And the DH-9A was so successful that it remained in RAF service until 1930. We're going to move on to another machine. This isn't a combat aircraft, but it is the RFC and RAF's first standard training aircraft, the Avro 504K. Now, the Avro 504 was a pre-war design dated from 1913, and some early 504s were amongst those first aircraft that went to France with the RFC in 1914. But it was soon outmoded for frontline service, but it lingered on as a training aircraft. And in fact, when the J and Ks came along, they were the machine that the RFC and the RAF standardized its training on. As I've already said, when the Fokker Scourge comes along, there is very low survival rate for a lot of these new pilots. They're coming out with a maximum of sort of 20 hours solo flying and little combat skills instruction. During the Battle of the Somme, the RFC loses 308 pilots, 191 observers, and in 782 aircraft altogether. And some of the replacement pilots at this time are going out, and they've got little more than 5 hours solo flying before they're going out. At the same time, French and German pilots had on average 50 hours solo flying before they went to their squadrons. The problem was the great expansion of the RFC. They needed to get personnel out there quickly to crew these squadrons, keep them going, keep Trenchard's forward policy heading forward. And they needed to scale everything up, but they were short of instructors. So many instructors were ex-frontline pilots, and these men were suffering from combat stress, basically, and training new pilots was not a good task to give to these guys who were absolutely stressed out anyway, as well as having to look after people that couldn't fly airplanes properly. They also had a lack of suitable aircraft. They were still flying Morris Farmans and BE-2, so the new pilots were not getting experience on aircraft that they would fly in combat or anything that would perform in any measure close to it. Now, the man who revolutionized training for the RFC was squadron leader Robert Smith Barry. He was a pre-war pilot and flying instructor and one of the original RFC pilots sent to France in August 1914. In 1916, he was commanding 60 Squadron, and he confronted Trenchard on numerous occasions, stating that sending untrained pilots into combat was sheer murder, and he disparaged the whole existing training system then in place with the RFC. He was given his chance to change things in December 1916 when he was sent to Gosport to command No. 1 Reserve Squadron. This was a training school to produce flying instructors for the RFC, and all of them would be taught to a set syllabus. In August 1917, the unit was renamed the School of Special Flying, and its ethos was to get trainee pilots to fly a standard aircraft of relatively high performance. It had to be suitable for all possible aerial manoeuvres, not to be a stable fly-itself type like the BE-2, because this would give pilots a false sense of security in their flying abilities. Pilots needed to be the master of both the machine and of themselves. And the aircraft needed to be dual control, so a trainee would always sit in the front pilot's seat and was given control for the maximum amount of time. Even after going solo, trainee pilots would still fly 50% of their time in dual control machines to learn more advanced manoeuvres and learn how to recover and avoid spins. The 504J and K were perfect aircraft for this, and by the end of the war, 8,340 had been built. And in fact, the 504N variant stayed in RAF service until 1933. The 504K was even used as a home defence fighter in the winter of 1917-18, because there was a shortage of aircraft in Britain at the time. So by marrying this aircraft with the Smith-Barry system, it ensured that RAF flying training became standardised during 1918. This gave the replacement pilots much improved flying skills and a knowledge of what to expect in combat. And it's really unfortunate this system was not introduced earlier in the war. After 1918, the Smith-Barry system was embraced across much of the world in flying services. So we're going to finish with an aircraft that fittingly spans the years, the war years, and the years where the RAF survives as an independent force, and that is the Bristol fighter, perhaps the best multi-purpose aircraft of the First World War, and one of the two-seater aircraft that was there to replace the BE-2, the other one being the RE-8, of course. Now, this aircraft first goes to France with 48 Squadron in March 1917, but its first active service use on the 5th of April 1917, a patrol of 6 aircraft led by William Leith Robinson VC, the man who shot down the first Zeppelin over the UK, but he doesn't really have any frontline experience as a flight commander, is a total disaster as the patrol runs into 5 Albatros DIIIs led by Manfred von Richthofen. 4 of the 6 Bristol fighters are shot down, including that flown by Leith Robinson. The problem was the Bristol fighter was being used as a 2-seater. It was being flown in a tight formation for mutual defence and wasn't using the aircraft's speed, fast climbing ability and manoeuvrability to any advantage. Once these abilities of the aircraft were fully appreciated, the Brisfit, as it was known, was highly successful. It was a fighter a photo recce machine, a tactical bomber, a ground attack aircraft, and a home defence fighter. It could fulfil almost any role it had to, and it played a key role in Allied battlefield success in 1918. The versatility of the Bristol fighter made it a perfect machine for the paired back the paired back RAF after the armistice. And you can tell how much the RAF was paired back after the First World War. At the end of the war, there are 301 airfields in the UK. After the war, there are only 30. Duxford is one of those that survives. It carries on as a training station. Now, the RAF now has a new battle on its hands to maintain its independence from the Army and the Royal Navy. Both of those old services want to re-establish direct control over their former air components. They realise how vital air power is to modern war, and they fear an independent RAF will find its own role and remit and neglect to cooperate with the other services. The RAF is now in a battle for vastly reduced military spending, and strong arguments had to be made for the RAF for it to survive as an independent military service. Trenchard, who was always an advocate for subordinating the air service to the needs of the army, now changed tack and to basically ensure the RAF survived independently. He played on growing public and political fears of strategic bombing by stating that the RAF would have a bomber force, and this would be a deterrent for other powers not to attack Britain. But if they did attack Britain, the RAF would also have a strong home defence fighter force. And Duxford spans this. In 1923, Duxford becomes a fighter station. So it moves being a training establishment to a fighter station to show the importance of that fighter element in home defence. Now, both of these, strategic bombing and home defence fighters, are strategic operational roles unique to an air force. And to detract to a cash-strapped government, Trenchard also held out a solution for cheap military control of the British Empire. This was air policing. Uprisings, he said, could be quelled by sending aircraft to bomb villages and to strafe armed groups. And this was much cheaper than the traditional approach of sending columns and columns of troops for weeks on end into the mountains, chasing people around. And it was on the volatile northwest frontier of India and in Iraq that the Bristol fighter continued to play a role until 1932, policing the empire. Its reliable Rolls-Royce Falcon engine and robust design made it eminently suitable to the rough and ready conditions on the edge of empire. As the 1920s and 1930s rolled on, the RAF's new priorities led to its army cooperation role withering on the vine. The army started to put its faith in mechanisation, but the lack of money meant that this was unachievable. The result was that when the British Expeditionary Force went to France in 1939, it went with effectively little in the way of direct air support. The BEF was fully motorised, but at heart it was an infantry force lacking adequate armoured forces and mobile artillery. That all-arms battle capability of 1918 had been lost, and it would only return with the creation of the 2nd Tactical Air Force to support Allied ground operations in Europe in 1944. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was a cracking talk. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. That was great. If you want to show your appreciation by raising your hands, I don't know, you've had more than 320 odd people watching that one.
Wow.
And I don't know if you can see on your screen, but all hands are shooting up now. Okay, we've already had quite a few questions coming in. So if you want to use the Q&A to ask a question of Alan, the first person I'm going to try and bring up is John Azar.
That was terrific. But all the innovation that's going on, could you tell us a little bit about the establishments, the organization that was designing all these changes and these new aircraft, and what was their relationship with the pilots who were flying them? You mentioned like the difficulty of using pilots to do training, But how did that design work? It's just amazing how much happened.
Yeah, I mean, a lot. I'm not overly up on this, to be honest, but the RNAS are pretty good at going out to private industry. So they're the people that are going out and approaching companies like Shorts and Sopwiths, etc. And you've got to remember, all of these aircraft companies, Handy Page, Sopwiths, etc., are all run by basically pioneer aviators. So people who started off building their own airplanes in sheds at home, and became, and their life was flying, and they were the guys who developed very, very good aircraft. The Royal Aircraft Factory, which the RFC relies on for a large part of the war, is a much more sort of stable organization. It's a big sort of, state-run organization. Does have some very good designers and people working for it, but unfortunately, like all big state-run organizations, is a little bit slow to move forward. There are some key people as the war goes on. It's a little bit like with the army, where you start off with a small organization, it rapidly expands. So a lot of the people in key positions, whether it be in procurement, design, or leading units, don't really have much experience of doing that job. But as the war goes on, more and more people with the experience get into those key positions, and that helps the RAF get to where it is at the end of the war. I mean, things like aerial photography, you do have some key people. You have Moore Brabazon, Victor Campbell, Laws. All of these people, they live and breathe aerial photography. So in some of the technical branches, there are people that is their lifeblood of doing this stuff. It's just getting their innovations noticed by the right people who can push it forward. And they're quite lucky that people like Haig quickly pick up on the usefulness of aviation, the usefulness of aerial photography, etc., and actually push this forward. And once it gets support by these key players, then it's much easier for them to innovate and move forward.
The other question I had was, I think all but two of the photos were all biplanes, and there was one triplane. But early on there was a picture of a German single wing aircraft. When was that transition made to single wing?
Well, I mean, they've got single wing aircraft very early on. The French have got their Marine aircraft as well, Marine Saulnier and things like this. And the British, they produce a couple of biplanes. I mean, the Bristol M1 monoplane is a very good fighter, but it's out of favour with the powers that be. They feel that the flying characteristics and capabilities of a biplane are inherently better. So the few monoplanes that get into service with the RFC, RAF end up in places like Palestine, Macedonia, where they're just desperate for airplanes. But monoplanes are always there, but in smaller numbers.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Gordon. You're up next.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Terrific that. Alan, thoroughly enjoyed it. We usually spend more time on the ground than we do in the air, don't we?
We do.
The Western Front. By coincidence, at my branch in Allerton Bywater on the 6th of April, we're having a talk on the Great War history of 8/208 Scout Squadron and their work in France and what they did by a chap called Colin Buxton, who I've heard is terrific. So we will look forward to that. However, my question is, could these World War I pilots jump into any of these aeroplanes and fly them? The many types, or were they trained to fly specifically just one or two kinds of machine?
I'm not 100% sure, but I think they could probably try their hand at most similar machines.
Yeah.
And you've got to remember, once they've started to train on those standard training aircraft, they're all being trained exactly the same way.
Right.
then they get posted to a squadron and they get up to speed on the squadron aircraft.
Right, the bombers.
They're not getting sent into combat. They don't arrive and the bloke goes, "There's an SE-5A, mate. Jump in. You're coming on a patrol with us now."
Right.
You get up to speed, and then once you're up to speed, then you go out. But you're then basically protected by your flight commander and some experienced pilots until you actually get up to, you know, you get some sort of experience of actually being in a combat situation. But through that Smith-Barry training method, the guys who are going out later in the war do actually have some nous when they're out there. Whereas early in the war, a lot of these poor buggers were just basically going up there and getting shot down. It was literally, if you could survive, you learnt.
Yeah.
You just learned through survival.
A lot of luck involved in that.
Yeah. And I mean, what we've got to, and what we have to remember, of course, is that everybody focuses on the single-seater scout pilots because they're the aces, they're the people winning the awards, they're the people in the newspapers, etc. But it's the guys in the two-seater planes. They're doing the bread and butter work.
Yes,
they are the guys that are actually doing what the RFC, RAF are supposed to do in the First World War, and they don't get any plaudits for that.
No,
and they get shot down in large numbers because flying those planes, no matter how good they were, was the sort of role they were doing was always more dangerous.
It's got to be a lot. I mean, these 20-hour men were being shot down, but so was Mallock and Ball. They were shot down as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, when you look at it, a lot of those guys were in combat for too long.
Yeah.
They came back too quickly. Even Richtofen, to be honest, he came back way too early.
It's a real good job that PTSD wasn't invented in 1914, 18, wasn't it? They've all been in bed. Right. Thank you very much for that. It's an excellent. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you, Simon.
That's good. Good to see you, mate.
And you. Thank you.
Fiona, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Thank you. Good evening. I have, maybe it's rather technical, Alan, but I have a particular interest in understanding the DH4 plane better. Because my grandfather was in one when the tail of the plane was shot through by anti-aircraft fire. And people witnessed this plane going into a steep dive, and then it evened out into it was described as fluttering like a leaf. And then it dived again, and then it fluttered, then it dived, then it fluttered. And people could see that my grandfather and his observer were crawling out over the wings trying to balance the plane. Unfortunately, the observer lost his grip, which was tragic, at 1,500 feet. And my grandfather hung on and was seen to throw himself clear just before the plane hit the ground. So, I mean, I don't know how often this happened, and I'm going to need to start rooting around on, I don't know, technical World War I websites that might be out there, like those guys that do the video games might know. Do you happen to know? I mean, was that unheard of, or was the DH4 particularly well balanced? I can't understand how it managed to do that.
The DH4 could take quite a lot of punishment. I mean, a lot of these aircraft could take a lot of punishment because they're basically stretched linen over a wooden or metal framework. So if you shoot holes through it, quite often, unless it hits a wire, or hits piece of the framework, it's going to go all the way through. I mean, it's not great if you're sitting in it because obviously there's not a huge amount of protection for your body.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that a lot of holes can be punched in these things and they'll continue to fly. Obviously, if you shoot off something like the tail or the elevators or something like that, then you are in pretty serious trouble. I mean, there are lots of recorded incidents, even in the Second World War, with B-17 flying fortresses having the tail shot off, and the plane still being able to sort of fly and make some sort of landing. I mean, it is amazing that sometimes an aeroplane stayed in the air when it shouldn't have done. But I don't know enough sort of technically about that. I mean, the best place you want to go for some information on that sort of thing is get in touch with the guys at the Shuttleworth Collection.
Right.
The Shuttleworth Collection is a collection of First World War aircraft. and
Oh, right,
replicate.
yes,
And they
yes.
know the sort of flying characteristics of these things. So I think if you talk to them, they could give you a lot of useful info.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd only thought of the people flying the DH4, they call it a Sally or something, don't they, in the USA? But much easier to find somebody in England. Thank you very much. That's
It's
very
okay.
helpful.
Thanks,
Right.
Fiona. Thanks. Before I bring the next question up, Vernon's chipped in on the Q&A. I think in response to one of the earlier questions about monoplanes, he put there was
Oh,
an
good man.
official prejudice to monoplane designs because of a result of a spate of crashes in 1913. And then he goes on to say that monoplane wings tended to fold up under the strain, whereas biplanes were considered more reliable.
Brilliant. Cheers, Vernon.
Okay, Christopher, do you want to unmute now?
Yes, good evening. I've never had the opportunity to ask an aviation military historian this question, but it's something that's fascinated me because I used to fly. How did pilots in the First World War navigate? I mean, in the days before radio navigation aids, presumably there was a magnetic compass in the cockpit, but that has its drawbacks because when you're heading in the northern hemisphere, it's slow when you change directions. So was most or all aviation in the First World War basically when the weather was good?
Yeah, I mean, if the if the weather's bad, I mean, the aircraft it was dangerous to fly a lot of these aircraft, and they just didn't fly. I mean, if they needed to, if it was a matter of absolute urgency, like in the German offensive, they would just put people up anyway. But yeah, a lot of the, I mean, Vernon will probably come in on this one as well, as he probably knows more than I do. But they did a lot, obviously, because they're flying particular missions. They would have at the beginning, they would actually be told where they were, so they get a map and they go over it. This is where we're going. These are the features on the ground that you're looking for, where you know where you are. You've also got you also have to take into account, of course, things like wind speed and wind direction to work out exactly where you, and your speed to work out where you're flying, and you can do loads of calculations. And they had these they had instruments where they could set.
Oh yeah, it's called the whiz. I assume the whiz wheel was born in the First World War. So would be things like the 1 in 60 rule, which says that after 60 nautical miles, a 1 degree error in heading means you're one nautical mile off course.
Yeah, so I mean, it's all that sort of thing. I mean, we're actually trying at Duxford. We've got some of the original technical huts where they were doing pilot and observer training, and one of them is a navigational training hut, and we're actually going to construct some interactives in that hut to get people to engage with some of the technology from the First World War for navigational training. We've also got a photographic hut there and a gunnery hut as well. So some of these, I've got a member of my curatorial team who's actually looking into navigational training and the sort of thing they were doing, and he's come up with all this sort of navigational mathematics. I sort of leave that to him because he's much better at maths than I am.
Thank you so much, Alan, for a fascinating talk.
No problem. Thank you, Christopher.
Bye.
Again, Vernon's chipped in on this. He's about navigation. He's put the same as now, using maps, landmarks on the ground, railway tracks, roads, rivers reflected by the sun or the moonlight.
I owe him at least a pint now.
All right, sorry, it's just this second coming with another one. The devastated ground of the front lines was many miles in depth. So as long as you knew which side you were flying over and didn't get disorientated, this was a major reference point for your sortie. Right, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Alan, I'm extraordinarily grateful because I'm listening on behalf of my late grandfather, who was a Bristol fighter pilot, and my great uncle, who died age 19 flying DH9 bombers, and I'm sure they'd love to hear what you've had to say. My question is bringing us right into the 21st century. How can the innovations that occurred during the First World War inform the way innovations and progress might take place a century later?
Ooh, blimey. In what ways? Do you mean military wise, or just flight in general?
I'm thinking in what's fascinating in your talk is the way the step changes took place, the way one innovation overcapped another one, and how innovations were necessary in order to make success possible, that the whole variety of things had to be correct. It wasn't just the technical innovation, it was the strategic innovation, it was having the manpower available, it was the personalities that were making the decisions. Has anything really changed that much in 100 years?
I don't think it has. I mean, the main thing that is not in play at the moment is that we're not in a war. I mean, war really drives technology, innovation, because you have to do it. I mean, if the enemy comes up with a better tank, a better aircraft, a better way of doing something, you have to counter it. So you put your best people on it. So what, medicine as well. Medicine is driven by, a lot of medical developments were driven by war, and it is that situation that wars, how terrible that they are. Quite often it is that impact that does drive things forward. I mean, when you think about the two world wars, this was, the whole nation was geared up to winning both of those wars. So you've got everybody in, well, you hope everybody in the best role they can do. You've got industries totally geared up for stuff. I mean, you've got all the, I mean, the great thing about the First World War is that people forget is just about everything that's done in the Second World War was pioneered in the First World War. But it's just that technology 25 years later is a hell of a lot better. So, all of these air developments, they're all done in the First World War, and they're all done much bigger scale because of technology in the Second World War. U-boats, the same, they're much more effective in the Second World War. Aircraft carriers, strategic bombing, all of this stuff. You've got, in the First World War, you've got companies, furniture companies, etc., go over to making aeroplanes. Exactly the same in the Second World War with the Mosquito. So it's and sort of people forget a lot of this. So the thing we're trying to do at Duxford is to show 1918 how good the British forces were in 1918, and basically how basically pretty rubbish they were in 1939. And people just think about the Battle of the Somme and Third Ypres, and that's all they think about in the First World War. The general public, not obviously not this audience, but it's just, and a lot of it is lazy journalism that just trots out the same stories on the 11th of November. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of innovations going on in places like the Ukraine. The Ukrainians are innovating like mad to keep on top of the Russians at the moment. So it was really that war situation that really pushes things forward.
Thanks, Jonathan. Just before I take in another video one, we've had 2 or 3 coming up. Vernon Creek says, yes, please, a pint or 2 would be nice, Alan. One of the early questions, and we can't bring the questioner up on the screen, is Arthur Lacey. He says, could I ask, what was the risk to the planes of ground fire?
Pretty huge. It depends on what kind of mission you're flying. If you're flying a contact patrol, you're flying pretty low, and yes, you're going to draw a lot of ground fire doing a contact patrol. If you're flying a photo recce operation. It depends on what height you're having to take the photographs from. If you're doing it from 2,000 feet or something like that, you're going to draw ground fire. If you're doing it from 20,000 feet, you're fine. When they were doing the strategic stuff from the DH4s later in the war, so it really depends on what mission you were flying. But you are vulnerable because, as I pointed out earlier, these aircraft are not particularly well armored. I mean, quite often the guy sat on an armored seat. That was basically it. But you have to remember he's got a petrol tank either in front or behind him as well. And if that gets punctured, then you're not, you ain't got a parachute either. So there's not a lot of way out of the aircraft. People used to jump out. Manic used to take a revolver up with him because he said he'd never jump, but he wouldn't burn. So yeah, ground fire was a problem. I mean, anti-aircraft fire was a threat. It was more of a threat to make aircraft go higher. Didn't shoot down that many aircraft, but it forced people to go higher, which meant that their recce work wasn't as good.
Okay, Terence, you were one of the first questioners, so do you want to ask your question of Alan? Okay, well, Terence's question was, how would the war aircraft compare with the Cessna 172, which Terry used to fly from Barton?
I don't know is the answer to that one.
No, okay.
Steve.
I
can't answer that because I don't really know the performance. I mean, I would say again, go to the guys at Shuttleworth.
Okay. Steve.
Hello, Simon.
Oh, yeah.
That was a wonderful chat. What I had was a question in regards to the forward airfields, the air bases, and just the logistics. I've visited a few of the spots, and there's very little to see. But it's always interested me is how do they secure enough fuel and oil on a timely manner, and then move beyond the move. So I'm just sort of interested in what you might know about the logistics of on the ground support.
Yeah, well, the logistics are pretty good for the British from 16 onwards. Everything's, got to remember, everything's pretty static until 1918. So once you've got some good airfield locations, and you've got to remember that your RFC wings are subordinated to various British armies and army corps on the ground. So you're plugged into that logistical network, and the British have got a really good system of railway supply. And a lot of these airfields are on that transport network grid, so it's pretty good to keep the fuel supply, etc., getting to those units. So you're going to get if you're not on a rail link, you're going to be on a light railway or a road. And you've got to remember, hundreds of thousands of 3-ton lorries ploughing every day along these roads in France to keep the British Army in the field, and to keep the RFC in the sky is just one of the jobs of that logistic chain. So,
were you ever aware of a shortage that Were you ever aware of a shortage that impacted regular flights or action?
I'm not. I would turn to Vernon again for that. He's been studying the RAF longer than I have. I mean, 1918, there is a big problem because the Germans are advancing so quick that a lot of these airfields are overrun. I mean, they get the the planes up in the air and just fly them out and get them out of the way. But some of the airfields and things are overrun. They lose lots of equipment, or they destroy it before it can go. But I'm not personally. I'm not aware of the British suffering a major lack of fuel for their air force. Yeah. I mean, obviously the Germans are basically pretty screwed by late 18 because the blockade is causing a major problem. I know they've got the oil fields in Romania, but they're having problems getting, moving the fuel supply from Romania across the railways by 18. And that's really why aircraft like the Fokker D7 didn't really focus in my talk, because the British have got air superiority. The British and French have got air superiority by then, and even by the Germans bringing these aircraft in, they can't manufacture enough of them, and they can't keep the fuel supply to keep enough of them in the air to really make a difference. So I think the British have got a really good logistics system in the First World War, especially from 16 onwards.
Fair enough. Well,
thanks,
thank
Steve.
you very much.
Thank you. And we do have several more questions, but we're going to wind up, I'm afraid, with we're running out of time, with Sarah.
Hello, thank you for a lovely talk. So I would like to know, were people keen to join and go in these newfangled machines, or was it very much the rich boy club who could afford it from pre-war times?
I mean, initially, yes. I mean, initially, it's people who can afford to go and get trained. But as it goes on, there are a lot of there's still a lot of people who want to get out of the trenches after a period of time, and a lot of officers, it's primarily young officers, think, okay, it's dangerous, but it's a hell of a lot better than sitting in a wet trench 8 days and then just going behind the line for 8 days and coming back in again and having to go in advance across no man's land. I mean, it's bloody dangerous, but at least you get, at the end of the day, you get to sleep in a decent bed, get some better food, have a few drinks.
A better view?
Oh, yeah. Well, exactly. But you see, there are a lot of, when they're expanding this, there are a lot of people who are already in the RFC on the ground who are put forward to become pilots. So there are people who went in as drivers, mechanics, etc., who after a while get recognised, because it's a technical service. So the people running this organisation they can spot people who've got potential, and a lot of these guys get put up for pilot training and sent back to the UK and come back as pilots. And you do get a reasonable number of sergeant pilots coming in who are actually NCOs. So their big problem is, of course, that they find that they don't really fit in the squadron anymore, because, socially, because they can't go in the officers' mess because they're a sergeant. But if they go in the sergeant's mess, they're not sort of really one of the lads anymore because they're pilots. So it's a little, they're in a little bit of a sticky sort of situation there. But yeah, a lot of these guys, but it is popular and a lot of people want to do it. I think it's just for a lot of people, it's the fun of getting in an airplane and flying about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who's been watching. And apologies to the few people who asked questions where we've run out of time. So big thanks once again to Alan for a very, very, very interesting talk. Just like, Alan, Vernon did chip in several times, but I just didn't have time to read out his contributions. So you can pick those up with him later on.
He's only getting 2 pints, so.
Okay, well, thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. Once again, thanks to Alan. Alan, I'll ping you an email either later or tomorrow morning, but thanks ever so much again
Simon.
and to everyone for joining us, and hope you've enjoyed it.
Mademoiselle